So now we're going to just go straight into the sermon, and we're going to talk more about grilled cheese, just a little bit, because because one of the things that we face as a family on a daily basis, I would say multiple times a day, is a really difficult choice. And we every day there are several points along the way where we have to stop and we have to get together and we have to sit down and look at each other in the eye and have a really serious conversation involving the question, what should we eat? And this is, and I can tell from some of the looks on your face, this is not like sometimes the strongest conflicts can come out of this question, not because everyone has like a really strong opinion, but because no one wants to choose. Am I right? So there are lots of us who are in situations where daily we are faced with these with a choice of like, I don't know, meatloaf or pizza, and it becomes sort of like a this could get really ugly if we don't come to a choice really fast, because and I know, by the way, I know people, and my guess is so do you, who they have like maybe 2 or 3 meals that they constantly just rotate through all the time. And there's a part of me that's kind of a little bit judgmental about that, because I think like there's so much more to life. Like just imagine what you could do just with grilled cheese. But like you can but I know some people who like it's like lunch is the same meal every day. I go to lunch with my dad pretty frequently because we work together, and he goes to the same restaurant and orders exactly the same thing every single day for lunch. And there's a freedom in that. I realize, like, I couldn't live that way, but there is a freedom in that because you don't have to expend the mental like energy trying to make choices like this. Like you can just say, like, that choice is taken care of. I will think about more important things than this. And so, but for a lot of us, like, there's a lot of energy and brain power that has to go into like this one relatively small choice that we make multiple times a day for some of us. And so while the question of what to eat and can be quite time consuming and very frustrating, just in terms of like it feels like the stakes could not be higher for some reason a lot of the time, but it's actually relatively low stakes. Like, yeah, we won't starve, we will figure something out eventually, and then tomorrow we'll repeat this whole cycle again. But then on the other hand, we are quite often faced with choices where the stakes are actually much higher. It goes way beyond what exactly do I want on my grilled cheese. It goes into, okay, if I make this particular choice and I do it incorrectly, that could have long-lasting implications for my family or myself or my livelihood. And so we a lot of times we are making very high stakes choices, but sometimes we think about them less. Like we spend less time thinking about those things than we spend on what are we going to get for lunch. And so there are these moments where we have to make choices, and we have to. I think probably all of us, we make hundreds, if not thousands, of very small choices every day that kind of add up to who we're becoming and the kinds of people that we are shaping ourselves into. And so, like, we make choices about how to resolve conflict with a person. And we can enter into these situations in lots of different ways. And the result of that can have long term effects. Or we make financial decisions. We decide, like, do we try and move into a different home? Do we buy a new car? Do we put our kids in public school or private school? Do we, and so we have these choices that are quite, significant, that do impact us in much longer sort of time frames. Like whether or not to accept a new job, whether or not to quit your old job, parenting choices. Like every single day we're making lots and lots of choices, and those choices become sort of the cumulative result of, or they result in sort of who are we becoming. Like you look back and I am now sort of the end result of thousands and thousands of small choices that I've made over the course of my life. And sometimes we are faced with choices that have almost no bearing on who will be tomorrow. And sometimes we're faced with choices that move us closer or farther away from who we actually, like, who we were created to be and who we need to become. And so all this to say, the current series we're in, we started a series last week. We're going to take this through July. Is we're doing a series on the book of Jonah. It's called Jonah, the Very Worst Prophet. And so what we're doing with this series is we're kind of breaking down, and we talked about last week how a lot of times the whole story becomes about a guy who gets swallowed by a fish, which obviously that's like the most flannel boardable veggie tales illustratable way to talk about this story. But as it turns out, that's actually a fraction of the story, but it is the part of the story we'll talk about today. So we're looking at this series, and we tend to get bogged down in the more fantastical fish related details of the Jonah story. But ultimately, the Jonah story, if you look at it from like a whole, like if you take a couple steps back and look at the whole thing as it unfolds, you realize, oh, this is actually just a story about a person who's making choices and how those choices are pushing him farther towards or pulling him farther away from who it was he was created to be. And so, surrounding the story of Jonah are questions about what choices are Jonah is, or what kinds of choices is Jonah making, and how are these choices revealing or shaping or defining who he's becoming. It's way bigger than what are we going to have for lunch. It's like these are choices that actually like add up to who. Okay, well, who am I? What kind of person am I becoming? And so up to this point, and last week we got into the first 3 verses of this book, and so we're going to go a little faster than that from here on out. But up to this point, Jonah is what we saw last week is Jonah's supposed to go to Nineveh, the city called Nineveh, which is part of the Assyrian Empire, but he decides to go towards another city called Tarshish. And we talked about sort of the kind of what the writer's doing by juxtaposing these 2 cities against each other. And so what Jonah does is he boards a ship that is headed in the direction of Tarshish away from Nineveh. And almost immediately there's a giant storm at sea. Not unlike driving on Kelly yesterday, if you happened to be out driving in that giant rainstorm yesterday. So there's a giant storm that hits while Jonah is on this boat at sea. And so in Jonah chapter 1, verse 7, it says, "Then the sailors said to each other, 'Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity.' They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah." So basically, they go out to sea. The storm starts to rage, and of course, at this time, and in this place in the ancient Near East, there's no like weather system discussion. There is no sense of, well, obviously we should have checked the radar before we got out on our boat. It's, oh, we got on a boat and now the storms are raging. The gods must be angry. And so what they're doing now is basically, and this is an ancient way of basically just trying to figure out like, whose fault is this? So casting lots is a reflection of a very old system of belief, which is who here on this boat has angered a god or the gods. And so they cast lots, and it says the lot fell to Jonah. And so they discerned from whatever it is that they did that it's actually Jonah's fault that there's a storm because the gods are angry at him. And so in verse 8, it says the sailors asked Jonah, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" So they've got lots of questions because they flipped a coin and it came up on Jonah and they were like, okay, we need to know everything about this guy. And so they start like peppering him with all these questions, trying to figure out like what have you done to anger the gods or a god? And it says, Jonah answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord." And as you notice, we talked about this a few weeks ago, the capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D is a reflection of these specific Hebrew letters that are specific transliterations of the 4 letters that make up the proper noun name of God, Yod He Vah He, or what we would transliterate as Yahweh. So so he says, "I'm a Hebrew and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." In verse 10, it says, "This terrified them, and they asked, 'What have you done?'" And in parentheses, this is my favorite part. It says, "They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so." So like when you board a ship and you buy a ticket and somebody says, so is this business or pleasure? He's like, oh, well, obviously I'm running away from the Lord. Oh, well, you can go sit with the other people who are also doing that. I don't know. Like, so he has not told them anything else about him. Like, notice earlier it says, tell us who's responsible for this. What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you? He hasn't told them any of those things. The only information he's already disclosed is, I am running away from the Lord. They're like, sure, come on. And so they already know about this one thing, and now he's kind of unpacked the rest of it. And then in verse 11, it says, the sea was getting rougher and rougher. And so they asked him, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down? Pick me up and throw me into the sea, he replied, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land. So they're like, we are not throwing this guy in the water. That seems crazy. It seems cruel. Like, we're basically going to murder this guy to get the storm to stop. And so they decided, like, let's not make that plan A. And so it says they did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to not their gods, they cried out to the Lord. And it says, please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. So now they realize, like, Jonah's right. Like, we have to throw him overboard, but they feel really bad about it. And so they're basically like begging for forgiveness. Like, we're going to throw this guy overboard like he's asking, but we feel very conflicted about it, and we would like forgiveness in advance. So it says, do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man for you, Lord. For you, Lord, have done as you pleased. Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. In verse 16, it says, at this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. So this is super interesting. There's a lot going. And again, if you've only heard like the VeggieTales version of this, it's easy to sort of kind of miss a lot of what makes this story interesting. So there's a couple of interesting details just right off the bat here. One is this is probably being written for a Hebrew audience. Which also, by the way, this story is probably not written by Jonah. It would be unusual for someone to write a story this unflattering about himself. So it is very likely that this story is not being written by Jonah. It's probably being written by another Hebrew prophet for a Hebrew audience. And so if you are going to write a story about a Hebrew prophet for a Hebrew audience, you probably would want the Hebrew prophet to be the hero of the story. That's what you would expect. You would expect this person in your story to be this like giant of the faith, like this model of great faith and wisdom and courage. And so it's really interesting that this whole kind of book revolves around a guy who is not super likable. And so most cultures at this time honored and revered their prophets. The prophets in most cultures would have been like the most sort of the most looked up to people in society. And so this story kind of subverts all of that. But Jonah doesn't look good in this story at all. There's nothing that Jonah does here, or at least nothing that Jonah has done so far, that in any way comes off as admirable or respectable in any sort of way. Jonah is not the hero of the story so far. So the writer turns the whole story upside down. The non-Hebrew sailors are doing and saying all what we would describe as the right things. They are praying, they are offering sacrifices, they are feeling conflicted over the possibility of taking the life of another person. And so the non-Hebrew sailors are doing all the things. Like, so far, they are the most admirable characters in the story, while the Hebrew prophet is doing all the wrong things. He is running from the presence of God, like what we talked about last week. He feels no remorse or inner conflict over any of his choices up to this point. And basically, he tells them to kill him because he's busted. Like, look, there's really nothing to do here. Like, I'm caught. You're gonna have to kill me. And so like that's where we are with Jonah in the story. So the writer is doing this really interesting kind of, again, this subversion of all of the expectations that would have been held by the people who would have originally heard the story, which is all these, he's making the non-Hebrew characters more heroic than the Hebrew prophet in the story. So what is the writer showing us? The writer is showing us, he's saying, all of your dualistic categories, all this black and white thinking that you're used to, all the like the right, wrong, good, bad, all of these dualistic ways of seeing reality, like that doesn't really always work. That actually does not work here at all. Like the people you expect to be wrong are right, and the guy you expect to be right turns out to so far be 100% wrong. And so he's completely flipping upside down all of our expectations about what do we even expect to happen here in the story. And so a common motif throughout this book is the common categories and expectations are never as reliable as we assume they are. And this will continue to show up in like further on down into the story. Like you continue to see the writer completely shaking up what you might have expected a Hebrew prophet writing about another Hebrew prophet to say. And so we currently, I mean, this is a completely trite and obvious thing to say. We currently live in a very polarized world, do we not? And so, what's the most obvious thing I could possibly say? It is very likely that most of us here, if not all of us, are more comfortable identifying with one particular group than another. And you can substitute the word group with whatever like categories you want. So we live in this time and in this place where there's a group that we identify as mostly, if not always, right, and there's another group that we identify as mostly, if not always, wrong. Right? Like that is sort of the posture I think that we've kind of that is in the atmosphere that we live in, and so, however, if have you ever been in a situation where you were listening to two people on opposite sides of a discussion and they're having a discussion or they're having an argument and maybe you've been listening to what both of them are saying and you thought to yourself, well, this is interesting because both of these people are making some good points, but also they both sound a little bit misinformed or ignorant or even sometimes a little bit hateful, a little bit hostile in possible ways that that is unnecessary in this situation. So it's like both people in this conversation are a little bit right and a little bit wrong. And so how do we square that with a everybody goes in certain columns and they don't get out of those columns? You know what I mean? And so in real life, this posture of this person or group is always right and that person or group is always wrong, that almost never works. And the writer of Jonah is basically saying, don't let those categories, don't let this these like columns or buckets or however whatever metaphor works best for you. Don't let that define how you look at the world. Don't just always assume that because this guy is wearing our jersey that he's always right and that these guys who are sailing the ship because they're not wearing our jersey that they're just automatically going to just do all the wrong things in the story. Like the world is a lot more interesting than that. There's a lot more nuance than that. But it's easier for our brains to take in like, oh no, this person's always right and this person's always wrong. And if we begin to subvert that, it gets really, really uncomfortable really fast. And that's what this writer is doing. So then in verse 17, it says, now the Lord provided a huge fish, which is, the thing that most people know about the story. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. So here's where a lot of people kind of, there are two basic kinds of responses to this story that I've observed. One is the response of, listen, if you take the story of Jonah literally, you are crazy. Like why it is easy for someone to look at this story and be like, this is why people should not take the Bible seriously. This is insane. This is Pinocchio. You know what I mean? Like this is there like why would anybody buy into any of this if this is the kind of story that you're telling each other? And so that's one posture. The other posture is, well, it's 100% true because the Bible says it and I believe it and that settles it and don't argue with me anymore. And so it becomes, and so there are these two these two dualistic sort of, this group says all of it has to be wrong. And this other group saying, well, it all has to be right. The end. And so let me see. So let's kind of unpack both of those postures. So let me see if I can successfully alienate every single person in the room. Keep in mind, no matter how angry you get with me in a minute, there is grilled cheese later. Hold that in your heart. So let's start with the first camp. If you fall into the first camp, the camp that would be more likely to say, look, there is no way any of this ever really happened. First of all, I think that's fine. I think if that's your if you read the story and you're like, look, I cannot get behind the story. This is where you lose me. Like I don't think that that needs to be like the thing that just like snaps your beliefs in half. You know what I mean? Like you do not have to read this story as literal for the story to have meaning for you. I don't think the writer is telling the story so that you will take it literally. I think the writer is telling the story because he's trying to make a larger point. And so if the believability, if the actual literal believability of a man spending 3 days and 3 nights inside the belly of a fish dictates whether you gain anything from this story or not, please allow me to set you free. It really is okay. The point of this story is not did this literally happen or did this literally happen or did this not literally happen. I do not think that the writer is all that interested in whether or not you have an opinion on that. However, I will say this. There are lots of things that we cannot explain. There are lots of things that cannot easily be naturally reproduced in the wild. And so maybe there are things that we cannot fully comprehend in this universe. For sure, there are. And sometimes our faith is expressed by embracing a certain amount of mystery and wonder. Ashley and I did a series a while back called I Asked for Wonder. And one of the things that series I think that we were trying to explore in that series was, yeah, well, what do you do with the stuff that you can't necessarily like put your arms around and like add data to it? You know what I mean? And so sometimes there are things that move beyond a space and like a point of view that we can easily sort of again like replicate or understand. And so it is possible that this story is inviting us into a little bit of wonder, into a little bit of imagination. And so to shut ourselves off from any amount of wonder or imagination may end up making it harder for us to engage in things that are a little bit more less difficult to put in or less easy to put into like easy explainable categories. You know what I mean? So all that to say, like I think if you so I'm trying to thread this weird needle of like, yeah, if you can't get behind like the literal fish, like that, I think that's fine. I wouldn't worry about it too hard. However, like I do want to encourage us to continue to look for opportunities to experience some amount of wonder and curiosity in the universe. So there's that. So, however, if you fall into the second camp that insists, well, the story has to be 100% literal, because if this story isn't literal, then none of the Bible is, and so we might as well just get rid of all of it. Um, it is, first of all, let me just say, settle down. So it is possible to take this story literally and still completely miss what the story is actually trying to say. It is possible to get so bogged down on did this guy really spend 3 days inside of a fish and miss what is the story actually about? Because it's not actually about the fish. The fish is a fraction of what the story really is. And if this is the only thing that we think about, then we absolutely miss what the writer is actually trying to tell us. So, in the process of defending like the literal truth of this story, please do not like lose the forest for the trees and not pay attention to what exactly is this story really trying to say. So that good? Everybody's upset? Yeah. Okay, good. So anyway, what the writer does seem interested in here is how do the choices that Jonah is making shape him? How have all of Jonah's choices led him to this moment? And then after this moment, how do Jonah's choices shape who he's becoming in the aftermath of this event? Is he becoming more or less of who he was actually created to be? That is the central question of this story. Not the literal, is there a fish or is there not a fish? The question is, who is Jonah becoming? And what kind of posture is Jonah taking towards the world? Is Jonah, again, because we enter into the story where Jonah is a flawed character, a deeply flawed character. And the writer is acknowledging that, like openly, and saying, like, yeah, Hebrew prophets can get it wrong sometimes. Like the best of us can sometimes reflect the worst of us. And so what the writer is asking is it possible for our choices to help move us or to move us towards the version of us that we actually are invited to become? The point of the story is not and has never been the fish. The point of the story is Jonah is moving farther away from the person he was originally created to be. And that is why he finds himself in this moment, in this time. This is a story about a man struggling with his own path in the world. I would argue the question of this story has never been, did Jonah happen? The actual question of the story is, does Jonah happen? The question here is, how do we find ourselves in the story? How are we becoming more or less the people that we were always created to be? All right. So then let's move on into chapter 2. So Jonah chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, it says, from inside the fish, because we all have like long inner monologues inside the fish. So it says, from inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God, which, yeah, that's probably what I would do too at that moment. And then in verse 2, Jonah says, in my distress, I called to the Lord and he answered me. He's very articulate for a man inside of a fish. So it says, in my distress, I called to the Lord and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the sea, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed wrapped around my head. It's getting very descriptive. To the roots of the mountains, I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord, brought me up from the pit. Now, notice, by the way, Jonah is using a lot of death language here, right? And so, because he's not just talking about I'm underwater inside of a fish, he's saying like I was dead. And by the way, and this is critical because in the ancient Near East, and we've talked about this before, there was a 3-tiered notion of the universe. And so the idea was all humans live on this plane that we call Earth. And then up high, but there was no concept of like space or the galaxy or whatever. It was just up. And so up in what they would refer to as the heavens, that's where God or the gods lived. And anything below the earth was the realm of the dead. And the sea, whatever was inside the sea, also lived in the realm of the dead. So throwing Jonah overboard isn't just like he's going to have to swim really hard. It is basically we are casting him into death. And so the idea here is Jonah is under the water in basically what amounts to a like living, breathing coffin. And so, and he's using a lot of death language. And so when he says when he prays to God, he says, you brought me or brought my life up from the pit. What kind of language is that? That is resurrection language, is it not? So Jonah is using a lot of language that sounds like death and resurrection. And so in verse 7, it says, so he's continuing to pray. And he says, when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you to your holy temple. And so notice like he talks about my prayer rose, like everything is up down language. And so it says, those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. And for a lot of us, that is where the story ends. And so we often think of Jonah, and there's this interesting sort of like assumption we make when we talk about the story. And so we often think that Jonah needs to be rescued from the fish, right? Like we think Jonah's prayer is, please get me out of this fish, which is what I think a lot of us in a similar situation would probably tend to say. But Jonah is not asking to be rescued from the fish. Do you notice that? Like never once does he say, please get me out of here. We assume Jonah's prayer here is like, please God save me. But it's not. The prayer is a prayer of gratitude, which is an interesting posture at this moment to be taking. Jonah is saying, thank you, God, for rescuing me. Look at all the language he uses in this prayer. All of it is gratitude. You have saved me. I was dead and now I have been raised up. And you kind of want to tap him on the shoulder and be like, my guy, you are still inside of a fish. Like it is, I would not say we're out of the woods just yet. And so but his prayer seems to be one of gratitude. He seems to be saying, like, I have been resurrected. He does not seem to be rescued to me, but he is still inside the fish. So why is he already using resurrection language when he's still inside the fish? And so Jonah, in this moment, realizes that the fish is not what he actually ever needed to be rescued from. Jonah recognizes that the fish was God's way of rescuing Jonah from himself. So, because Jonah, where was Jonah prior to this? Jonah was moving, in the words of the writer, away from the presence of God. There was an identity that Jonah was supposed to step into and assume and embody. And Jonah said, no, thank you. And so the fish is not punishment. The fish is God's way of saying, let's take a minute and think about our choices. So this is time out. And so in this moment, Jonah is realizing who he was in the process of becoming, and that this event is the thing that pulled him away from a path that he was never supposed to travel in the first place. This is God's way of rescuing Jonah from himself. And so up to this point, Jonah was making choices that made him less and less of who he was created to be. The storm and the fish are the things that rescue Jonah from a path that he was never meant to be his path. So let's turn the mirror on ourselves for a second. So we often find ourselves in the midst of storms and fish. And we often find ourselves feeling the need to be rescued. And only later do we realize that the storm and the fish were the thing that were rescuing us from a path that we were never, ever meant to travel in the first place. Rather than use language like storm and fish, you could say things like disruption. You could say something along the lines of a thing that kind of shook me awake into, oh, the path that I'm on is actually taking me to places that I don't want to go. I'm following a map that goes nowhere. And so the storm and the fish becomes a disruption as a way of saying, like, maybe we take a minute and maybe we ask ourselves questions about who are we becoming and what does it look like for us to follow a path that we are actually meant to travel. Have you ever been in a season of disruption and frustration, and you so badly wished it could just be a little bit easier? Could this just be a little bit less difficult? And then over time, you look back and you realize that the disruption was actually the thing that you needed to remind you of the path that you were always meant to travel in the first place. Sometimes the disruption is the thing that rescues us from a path that we were never supposed to be on. Now, let me pause and add a caveat. What I am not saying, please do not hear me say this, is God is causing you to suffer because you will make better choices after you have suffered. I do not believe that. I am not saying that. What I am saying is sometimes we come up against some sort of friction in life or some sort of disruption. And over time, we realize that we actually needed something like this, to happen to force us or to force me into keep moving forward and to keep growing, because I was getting a little bit stale. Things were getting a little bit comfortable. The choices were the same every day. And I realized, like, oh, the disruption actually forced me to have to make new choices. And so and I've talked about this before, but in 2013, I was working at a really large church in the North Texas area, and it wasn't a good fit for me. And I'd be happy to, like, off mic, I'd be happy to talk about, like, all the reasons why it wasn't a good fit, and I really needed to not be there. But it was a job, and I had two small kids, and we had a house, and it became sort of like well, what am I going to do if I'm not here at this large church? And also, by the way, at that same time, I was quietly going through a deep season of doubt and deconstruction. I was, like, truly, like, looking at all of the things that I had been like raised to believe, and genuinely, like, one by one asking questions about, like, is this right? Is this real? I often use the metaphor of, it's like if you have a room and it's full of furniture and you don't really know what furniture still belongs in the room. And so what you do is you pull all the furniture out and you begin to look at the room as just an empty room, and you begin to examine each piece of furniture and ask like, okay, what needs to go? What needs to just go to the curb and never come back in? And what needs to come back inside? And so I began to do that with like almost everything that I thought, everything that I believed in the process of also working at a big church. So I'm on staff at a very large church, a high profile church in the North Texas area, while secretly kind of unraveling everything that I think I believe, which by the way is really bad for your career if you're working at a really large church. And so both these things are happening simultaneously, and it was frustrating and it was also scary. And ultimately, I was let go from that job, not because of my deconstruction or anything like that, but because of a joke I made during a sermon that nobody thought was funny, and which I'm sure you're like, that's hard to believe. So, um, so I was let go from this church, and so now I'm in this place of, okay, I'm still putting my beliefs back together, but now I don't have a job, and what do I do? What do I do with this? And I remember like several nights like during that whole season thinking like I just really wish this could be easier. I just really wish like some kind of like easy answer would just appear and I could just do that one thing. And looking back, like I look back at that, it was a really like specifically defining time in my life because I needed it. Like I realized like I look back at that and think, "Oh, I needed to reconfigure my beliefs." I absolutely did. Like, I needed to grow. I needed to evolve in lots of ways that I was not able to do if I had just kind of like stayed put. And also, I needed to be, if you will, spit out of this environment that was actually not great for me or my family. And so it was painful and it was again very disruptive and it was really scary. But looking back on it, like I'm so glad I'm not still in that space. Life has gotten a lot more interesting and a lot more exciting and better in all sorts of ways as a result of the disruption. But I needed the disruption, and so I don't know who I would be if I had never gone through any of that. And those things saved me from a path that I never needed to be on in the first place. So I wonder how many of us now, at this moment, are in a season of some kind of disruption. I wonder how many of us would describe our situation in a way that feels like storms and fish. And what kind of environment like do I find myself in? Is this am I in a time of, yeah, things are a little bit uncertain and things are a little bit scary and I don't really know what the next thing is going to look like. I would argue your job in this world is the relentless pursuit of who you were created to be. That each of us has been invited to travel a path. And that my job is to figure out what is that path and what does it look like for me to every day make choices, big and small, that make me into the person that I was created to be. And sometimes disruption, sometimes fish and storms are a way to remind us that, yeah, sometimes the path can be a little tricky. And sometimes we need to be kind of shaken awake in order to force us to keep traveling that path. So Jonah, inside this fish, talks about the resurrection while he is still in the fish because he realizes the fish rescued him from a path that he was never meant to travel. And so he's praying gratitude, not because he thinks he will get spit out of the fish, but because he realizes I never needed to be on that path to begin with. And this disruption is reminding me of that. So maybe you're in a place that you never planned to be and you're looking for normal again, and it feels like normal is a long way off. And maybe that's how we discover our path in in the beginning, or maybe that's how we initially discover our path is the realization of, oh yeah, normal. The thing that I think of as normal, that was actually never the path. The path is actually a lot more interesting than that. Because here's the thing, like once you begin moving in that direction, once you begin to realize like all of the beauty and excitement that comes along this path with you, like yeah, it's really hard to turn back. And it's really hard to say like, yeah, I'd really like it to just go back to like, if you asked me today, like, would you go back to 2013 and take your old job back and just like reprogram your brain to just go back to believing all the stuff that you believed before you began to unravel that stuff? Absolutely not. I don't want to go back. I would never want to go back. But I didn't know that at the time. And so I think this story is an invitation to self reflection and examination. Maybe the fish is an opportunity to re examine my own path and to ask, am I living the life I was meant to live? Am I traveling the path that I was meant to travel? Am I becoming the person I was created to be? Am I making choices that reflect who I was always meant to be? So if you are in the midst of disruption, may you take heart and may you find hope and discover something beautiful about your path. May you find that the disruption oftentimes in the rearview mirror feels like a gift, even though in the moment it does not feel like a gift. It feels like a curse. But then the further along the path you go, you look back and you realize like, "Oh, I needed that." That actually shook me awake in ways that I had no idea it could. And yeah, it can be really scary and it can be really painful, but also it can be something that reminds us like, "Oh, the whole thing is a lot more interesting than just ordering the same food every day," metaphorically speaking. We are invited to experience the wide range of life that this path offers us. And so, if you are in disruption, may you take heart and know you are not alone. There's absolutely no way you're the only one here in that space at this moment. So may you take heart in the knowledge that there are lots of us who are or have been experiencing some kind of disruption. And that's part of the journey. So may you find your path. May you make choices every single day that reflect who you were always meant to be. And may you find that sometimes the disruption is the thing that brings resurrection.